I'll be back on Friday at 4. I'll leave you with the weather. Take care. Enjoy your week.
So looking ahead then to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry in the east, but cloud and rain moving in from the west. Let's home in on the detail. Generally dry and cloudy across the southwest of England, some clearer spells, a band of rain and strong winds in the far west, slowly moving east. Feeling mild though, highs of 15. Remaining dry in the southeast of England, some clear spells in the evening and overnight, winds staying light with some patchy mist and fog later. Then cloudy across most of Wales with some clearer spells in the east, winds increasing at the coast with rain arriving in from the west later. Taking a look at the Midlands, it'll be much cloudier there, particularly in the evening across the region, but staying mostly dry. Some clearer spells at times. Southeasterly winds remaining light, however, it will be breezy over high ground. And remaining cloudy across the northeast with outbreaks of light rain and drizzle, some clearer spells confined to the west, breezy at the coasts, but lighter winds inland. And staying dry across most of southern Scotland. Cloudy in the east, patchy light rain and drizzle at times, breezy at the coasts, particularly in the west. And cloudy, wet and windy across most of Northern Ireland. However, drier in the far east, rain continuing to move slowly east through the evening, heavy at times. So dry then with clear spells, mainly in the southeast, but rain sometimes heavy, sometimes slowly eastwards, strong winds in the west.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV,
on radio and online.
We're proud to be
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Every Friday and Sunday night from 9, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
We're on the same page again. There's something weird happening.
Let Ian finish. Don't be such a cranky.
That mini budget was the tip of the iceberg.
And on Saturday, my show just got bigger. From 8, it's Mark Dolan's Saturday Night In.
You can't govern a country if you can't speak.
Stop talking.
My God, we reached the end. I've never been early in my life. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Good evening, I'm Tatiana Sanchez in the GB newsroom. His Majesty King Charles has led the Remembrance Sunday service for the first time as sovereign following the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth. The King and the Prince of Wales laid a wreath of poppies at the Cenotaph in central London. The wreath incorporated a ribbon which paid tribute to his late mother and grandfather, King George, by using their horse racing colours. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, Labour leaders Sir Keir Starmer and former Prime Ministers were also in attendance. 10,000 Royal British Legion veterans representing 300 different members of the armed forces took part in a march to honour the war dead. And a further 10,000 members of the public lined the streets of Whitehall to watch on and pay their respects. The nation fell silent to honour those fallen in the line of duty. Big Ben chimed 11 times at 11 o'clock to mark the start of the nationwide 2-minute silence. Services were held across the country, with bells ringing to commemorate all those who lost their lives. Defence Secretary Ben Wallace also commemorated the fallen and paid tribute to Ukrainians currently fighting for their freedom.
Today is a reminder that we've suffered wars in Europe before, and tens of thousands of British service personnel gave their lives, as did civilians, to defeat fascism. And here we are again, tragically, decades later, with a war on continental Europe and Ukraine. What Remembrance is about is recognising that freedom isn't free. People make sacrifices. This nation made the ultimate sacrifice on 2 occasions in the Great Wars, but also on other conflicts since, and Remembrance is a time to reflect on that.
World leaders have been arriving in Indonesia for the G20 summit, including Rishi Sunak, who's on his way. He's expected to call out Putin's regime over the war in Ukraine. Mr. Sunak will join the annual gathering of world leaders, saying this year's meeting will not be business as usual, with a focus on how countries can work together to solve global economic and security challenges. President Putin will miss the event and send his Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov instead. The Chancellor says everyone will need to pay a bit more tax after he announces his autumn budget next week, on Thursday. Jeremy Hunt warned sacrifices need to be made to get the economy back on track. He's thought to be considering a range of options, including an extended freeze on income tax and national insurance thresholds. Labour says further austerity is not the way forward. Turkey's President Erdogan says at least 6 people have been killed and 53 wounded in an explosion in Istanbul. The blast happened in a busy area of central Istanbul in Turkey, in the Taksim Square area. Emergency services were called to the scene and quickly cordoned off the area, and it's still unclear what caused the explosion. Well, 6 people are also dead after 2 planes crashed into each other at a World War II airshow in the US state of Texas. The crash happened yesterday during flying demonstrations at the Wings Over Dallas event, which honours veterans. Videos posted online show the 2 planes colliding and crashing on the ground before bursting into flames at the Dallas Executive Airport. Firefighters say nobody on the ground was injured. The balance of power in the US has become clearer, with the Senate race in Nevada now projected to go to incumbent Democrat Catherine Cortez Masto. Her opponent, Republican Adam Laxalt, was endorsed by former President Donald Trump. This means Democrats will once again control the Senate regardless of the outcome of the Georgia runoff election. Control of the House of Representatives is still unclear. The number of migrants who've crossed the English Channel in small boats so far this year has now surpassed 41,000. GB News understands around 300 migrants have been taken to Dover Harbour after attempting the journey so far today. Border Force vessels and RNLI lifeboats are also responding to a number of other small boat sightings off the Kent coast. Meanwhile, Downing Street says talks on a deal with France over Channel crossings are in their final stages. And King Charles will celebrate his first birthday as monarch tomorrow. He's expected to mark his 74th anniversary privately. As Prince of Wales, he often went away on official foreign tours during his birthday and would celebrate it overseas with a cake. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. We'll have more news at the top of the next hour.
So let's start the show today by talking about the importance of Remembrance Sunday. Paul, it's a very, as we saw in the news bulletin there, it's a very personal moment, not only for those who have served, but also their families and loved ones who may well have lost someone in the many wars Britain has fought in. What does it mean to you?
Well, I was coming into the studio, Emily, and just seeing the number of veterans who were kind of milling around in London, presumably on their way to the cenotaph. And it just kind of brings home to you, really, the sheer number of families, both now and in the past, who have been affected by war. I mean, there's probably not a family that's been untouched by it in some way. And that tells you really the level of personal sacrifice that families have made over the years. Families who have lost loved ones, families who have lost ancestors, families who have seen loved ones maimed in battle and so on. So I think of that level of sacrifice. I often think of my great-great-uncle, Arthur Embry, who was killed in the trenches in the First World War and whose grave I visited a couple of times.
Wow.
He was a member of the Poplar and Stepney Rifles, and he's buried in Bethune Cemetery in northern France. And actually, we can see on the screen there a picture when we went. I took my own kids to visit his grave a few years ago. So I often think of him, what he went through, what his comrades went through, and what so many people have been through. And I also think, Emily, that when it comes to the Second World War, there's not many veterans left, actually. I mean, when you calculate it, to have fought in the Second World War at all, you would have to be at least 95 years of age now. To have fought from the beginning of the Second World War in 1939, you would have to be over 100. So those people, most of them have gone. The rest are not going to be around forever. So it's as important as it ever was that we honour that sacrifice in the way we do.
And on that point, you say that there aren't many veterans still alive from the Second World War. Do you think Remembrance Sunday will change as we go forward? Future generations, will we remember it in the same way? Will we commemorate in the same way? Will it have that same sense of importance?
I hope it does. I mean, I think that we live today in a very kind of fast-moving, globalised, highly atomised, highly fragmented world. And I think this Remembrance Day is one of the few occasions that actually does unify us, takes us right back to first principles, to core principles, where we actually stop and think. We stop and think about what's important. We think about matters of life and death. We think about sacrifice, about loyalty, about duty. And those kind of values are timeless in many respects. So I'm sure the format will change as the years pass, and no doubt we get involved in new wars, but those core principles, I think it's important, remain.
Because I do feel that a lot of people living today do worry about the future of our country in terms of those core British values, patriotism, upholding liberal democracy, freedom, that many people view as sometimes under attack. We talk about how this occasion unifies, but of course there are always outsiders when it comes to moments like this, people who don't want to participate in anything that's seen to glorify war. Do you worry at all that future generations may neglect to remember in the same way we do now, perhaps don't hold on to those values of service and commitment and patriotism?
I hope not, but I sense the way society has gone over recent years, those old-fashioned, if you like, values of patriotism, sacrifice, self-sacrifice particularly, loyalty, duty, obligation. I sense that we live in an age where the self is important. We live in a fairly, selfish...
The selfie age.
Well, exactly, in more ways than one. And we also live in an age where, the values that those previous generations fought for in terms of freedom of expression, free speech, pluralism, democracy, against fascism, seem to be being undermined on quite a regular basis, actually. So there is a danger, I think, with today's mindset that we do move away from remembering in the way that we should. And it's up to those of us who believe in those values to push back against that.
And of course, today's service will be particularly poignant, as it was last night in the Royal Albert Hall. Will be particularly poignant as the Queen is no longer with us, and it will be King Charles's first service in this way, which he'll be leading. Does this mark a shift in our history as well?
I mean, it marks a milestone. I don't know if it marks an ideological shift particularly, because obviously the Queen, as Commander-in-Chief, had a very close relationship with the military. The military respected her. King Charles himself has served, of course, in the military as a younger man. I think he commanded his own frigate, actually, in the Royal Navy. So he has that intrinsic link with the military as well. Both his sons, of course, have served in the military. So I don't see that changing in any recognisable way soon, and that's a good thing, I think.
And it's just another chance to commemorate the Queen, of course, and her magnificent life. I must say, when you mentioned on your travel in that there were servicemen and women, the same on my train from Maidenhead this morning to the studio very, very early. It was quite moving to see how many men in their uniforms were taking that train into London, presumably to take part in the commemorations today. So the King will lead the nation in remembrance for the first time as monarch by laying a new wreath at the cenotaph. Nearly 10,000 people are taking part in the Royal British Legion's march past, paying tribute to Her late Majesty, the Queen. Our royal reporter, Cameron Walker, has more.
A changing of the guard. Just 9 weeks after the Queen passed away, King Charles will lead the nation in remembrance for the first time as King. A moving moment, according to royal author Katie Nicholl.
I think it will be a really poignant reminder to all of us watching, and particularly to the veteran community, that she's not here anymore. And it will be these moments, these points in the calendar where we're just so used to seeing the Queen. We're going to have to get used to having King Charles instead, and I think Remembrance Sunday is going to be one of those really nostalgic and important moments.
The late Queen was the last surviving member of the royal family to have served in the Second World War. Now her descendants will be out in force at the cenotaph to honour the millions who sacrificed their lives for our freedom. A new wreath, its ribbon bearing the King's racing colours, will be laid by His Majesty for the first time. It's expected to pay tribute to his grandfather and mother. The Queen Consort is expected to view the service from the Foreign Office balcony, and a royal household equerry will lay a wreath on her behalf. Racing colours inherited from Camilla's grandfather will echo a wreath from a previous Queen Consort, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. It's the poppy factory based in Richmond that has made Their Majesty's wreaths, along with 100,000 others delivered across the country. A nation united in honouring the fallen. Perhaps reflecting his commitments to the Welsh people, the Prince of Wales's wreath bears a new ribbon in Welsh red. It was previously laid by his father, featuring the Prince of Wales's feathers. Buckingham Palace has announced a long list of royals expected to attend the service, including the Princess of Wales, expected to appear on the balcony. The world wars may be confined to history books, but the war in Ukraine rages on.
Such truly terrible aggression.
As Prince of Wales, Charles publicly showed his support for Ukrainians across the Commonwealth. In an uncertain world, many look to the monarchy for stability. Cameron Walker, GB News.
Well, thank you for that lovely package, Cameron Walker, our royal reporter. Now we're back in the studio with me and Paul. And I wanted to talk, Paul, about veterans, because, of course, the money that we spend on our poppies goes to helping communities impacted by war, the armed forces, of course, and their families. Do you think in this country we treat veterans in the way they deserve to be treated?
I think it's obvious, Emily, that we don't actually. I think the way that we treat or mistreat our veterans is in many respects a national scandal. I mean, there can be no greater sacrifice for anybody to make than to say, I'm going to sign up for the armed services and I am prepared to go into a theatre of war, to do battle, to risk my life and to possibly lose my life in the service of my country. That seems to me to be the ultimate sacrifice that anybody is willing to make. And when people are prepared to make that sacrifice, the very least we can do is to make sure that we look after them, that when they come back onto Civvy Street, we've got sufficient mechanisms in place. I'm not saying we have a kind of nanny state kind of approach where we just kind of spoon feed everybody who's ever served in the armed services for the rest of their lives, and they wouldn't want that. But we have the mechanisms in place to make sure they have opportunity on Civvy Street, that we can get them into decent accommodation, that we can give them the skills to go out and work in a normal job, if you like, and that if they fall upon hard times, particularly some of those who have really been on the front line and seen the horrors of war and have been affected by it as they would be in a kind of mental capacity and have mental health issues, that you use all of the resources at your disposal as a state to come to the aid of those people. We don't do it. We see veterans lying homeless on the street. We see veterans struggling to get into accommodation. We see veterans unemployed. We see veterans who have turned to drink or drugs because of the horrors they've experienced and they haven't had the necessary health intervention. And that needs to be put right. It's something we constantly talk about, but nothing ever seems to change on it.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of our viewers have, a lot of the people at home have views on that, whether we treat veterans well enough. I know there's been quite a lot of anger or frustration, at least, when it comes to seeing the way in which the government is pumping so many millions into housing migrants and asylum seekers and illegal immigrants in this country in hotels, and then they see veterans and servicemen on our streets. And perhaps that's perhaps we shouldn't be drawing that comparison, but it is stark. It does seem that we have accommodation available when it comes to housing those who have crossed the Channel, but then not when it comes to some people who have served this country.
I mean, I don't think it should be an either-or. I mean, I've been very critical of the government's approach to migration policy, the complete breaking down of the system, the fact that we've completely lost control of numbers. That said, the reality is, migrants are human beings. When they're here, you can't see them on the street. It would be a fundamentally, I think, uncivilised thing to do. I think you need to give them decent accommodation. You need to give them food and clothing and so on. So I don't think we should necessarily counterpose the way that we treat migrants with the way that we treat veterans. I think people are human beings and you treat them as human beings. But certainly in the case of veterans, the people who, as I said earlier, are willing to make that ultimate sacrifice. The way we often turn a blind eye to them and neglect them in later life when they really need the protection of the state and the protection of the local community is a national scandal.
So looking ahead then to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry in the east, but cloud and rain moving in from the west. Let's home in on the detail. Generally dry and cloudy across the southwest of England, some clearer spells, a band of rain and strong winds in the far west, slowly moving east. Feeling mild though, highs of 15. Remaining dry in the southeast of England, some clear spells in the evening and overnight, winds staying light with some patchy mist and fog later. Then cloudy across most of Wales with some clearer spells in the east, winds increasing at the coast with rain arriving in from the west later. Taking a look at the Midlands, it'll be much cloudier there, particularly in the evening across the region, but staying mostly dry. Some clearer spells at times. Southeasterly winds remaining light, however, it will be breezy over high ground. And remaining cloudy across the northeast with outbreaks of light rain and drizzle, some clearer spells confined to the west, breezy at the coasts, but lighter winds inland. And staying dry across most of southern Scotland. Cloudy in the east, patchy light rain and drizzle at times, breezy at the coasts, particularly in the west. And cloudy, wet and windy across most of Northern Ireland. However, drier in the far east, rain continuing to move slowly east through the evening, heavy at times. So dry then with clear spells, mainly in the southeast, but rain sometimes heavy, sometimes slowly eastwards, strong winds in the west.
On the show this evening, in a Mark Dolan Tonight exclusive, we welcome former Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg live in the studio. In what will be a comprehensive and wide-ranging interview, we'll talk Brexit, the economy, Liz Truss's 44 days in power, and what he thinks of our new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. One of the best-known and most talked-about politicians in the country, Jacob Rees-Mogg is my Mark Meets guest. We're live at 9.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Every Friday and Sunday night from 9, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
We're on the same page again. There's something weird happening.
Let Ian finish. Don't be such a cranky. That mini budget was the tip of the iceberg.
And on Saturday, my show just got bigger. From 8, it's Mark Dolan's Saturday Night In.
You can't govern a country if you can't speak.
Stop talking. My God, we reached the end. I've never been early in my life. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for The Briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, The Briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing. You see, amazing.
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Now, Jeremy Hunt has warned of a tough road ahead after Britain's economy shrank in the 3 months to September, in what is expected to be the beginning of a lengthy recession. Now, while the rest of Europe is suffering from similar downturns, Britain is also the only G7 economy where quarterly GDP remains below pre-COVID levels. It's expected that Hunt will introduce brutal cutbacks paired with tax rises in order to cope with Britain's spiralling debt crisis. Joining us now to discuss the budget further is Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economic and Business Research, Vicky Price. Hi, Vicky. May I ask you a question just to set things out? We've heard about this fiscal black hole. How do we get to this figure of 50 to 60 billion pounds? And can one challenge that amount, or is that set in stone?
It's not set in stone, and we don't really know where this 50 or 60 billion pounds black hole has come from, frankly, because if you just look at what's been happening over the last month or two, we had the mini budget of September the 23rd. That had unfunded tax cuts of about 45 billion. Most of that has been reversed already. So 35 billion, roughly, of that is now being saved. So you would imagine that on that basis, you just have 10 billion to find, possibly. In addition, what has happened is that the electricity price freeze, which was supposed to be almost never ending. So we had 2 years of this freeze at the price of £2,500 per average household. Well, that is now going to be only 6 months. It had been estimated that that would cost hundreds of billions, possibly, depending on what would happen to the gas prices, of course, and electricity prices more generally. But that is now just for 6 months. And also similarly, of course, for businesses, which was going to be 6 months anyway, but it was going to be reviewed. So there could be something more that comes in terms of support. So we have to assume that that would be the case. But it is unlikely it's going to be the open-ended support, more or less, that was promised at the time. So you could argue there isn't any real fiscal hole there. But I think what the government is trying to do is ensure that the capital markets, which had been quite frightened at the time of the mini budget, now see a plan ahead in terms of how we can get back to possibly the debt to GDP ratio coming down at some point, which could be in 3 years' time, which is one of the fiscal rules that has been around for ages but hasn't actually been met yet for quite some time. And we might actually get a 5-year period during which you need to do it. Anything that gives some guarantee that this sort of move towards fiscal prudence again is going to be pursued. It's going to be good news for the markets. But in terms of what type of hole it is that we're trying to fill in, then frankly, loads of us are agnostic about it.
Now, Vicky, quickly before I bring Paul back into the conversation, we've seen how Liz Truss's budget was treated by the markets. Very much too fast, too much too fast was the verdict, it seems, the consensus verdict on that budget. Are we at risk of going too far the other way? I mean, the papers have been covering all sorts of reports, all sorts of leaks from government that taxes are going to be going up across the board, that everybody, this is what Jeremy Hunt has said himself, everyone will be paying more taxes. Are we at risk of clobbering the middle classes so much with tax rises that we end up having a longer, deeper recession as a result?
We are, and I think there is a danger that we might overdo it, particularly since interest rates are also going to be going up. Now, the question, of course, is what type of economy we're going to see in the future, because up to a point, if the economy slows down, as it's already doing, you tend to collect a little bit less in terms of revenues. So that's going to have to be fitted into the forecasts that are out there. But yes, there is that danger. Now, what we probably are going to see, nevertheless, is that benefits are going to be going up in line with inflation. We're probably going to see the triple pension lock still being maintained. So that's going to increase the spending, if you like, that the government needs to make. So that's going to be a sort of positive contribution as well to individuals. On the other hand, the most likely scenario in terms of tax increases is going to be just the freezing of allowances. It's a stealth tax, but as Jeremy Hunt's been saying, he's going to be open about it because quite often nobody talks about it. So if you freeze your personal allowances, you get many more people, millions more, starting to pay tax for the first time, and millions more paying tax at the higher rate. And if you adjust also the higher rate tax, the very high rate, the 45p one, to perhaps start a little bit earlier, then you hit those at the higher end, but nobody probably is going to complain too much about that. So if you do it that way, then perhaps you're not having quite the impact, the negative impact you would have otherwise, but it is still going to be an impact without any doubt.
Thank you very much, Vicky. That was Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economic and Business Research. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Paul, it does look like it's going to be pretty brutal for a lot of us. A lot of working people are going to be asked to pay more and more of their hard-earned money in tax. Is that fair?
Well, I think, and Vicky touched on it, at a macroeconomic level, I think the government is about to get it completely wrong. You cannot cut your way out of a recession. That was a lesson.
So you're referring to the public spending cuts that we're likely to see?
Certainly the public spending cuts. I think also the increases in interest rates. I think the increases in personal taxation, particularly for people at the lower end of the income scale. What it does essentially is it just chokes off any potential for recovery. That ought to have been a lesson that we learned way back in the 1930s when Western governments thought you could cut your way out of a recession or a depression, as it turned into at the time, and found that in trying to do that, all they did was made the situation a whole lot worse, because when everybody else, businesses and individuals, are retrenching and pulling in their belts, where's the recovery going to come from? The only agency with the ability to be able to stimulate the economy is government, and it seems to me that the government is going to make the mistakes that were made in the 1930s, and actually the mistakes that were made during the Cameron and Osborne years, where in the wake of the global financial crisis they thought the answer was austerity. I mean, let's be absolutely clear. Austerity is a political choice. It is not an economic necessity. And my theory is that by imposing some of the so-called remedies that Jeremy Hunt is about to, he's going to make the recession, as you mentioned, he's going to make the recession longer, he's going to make it deeper, he's going to make any chance of a recovery less and less, and a whole lot of people are going to suffer for it.
Now, I'm all for the government making efficiencies when it comes to government spending. I am sure there is huge amounts of money that could be saved in efficiencies. in our public sector across many of the departments. I believe he's going to be ring-fencing at the NHS. The NHS is always ring-fenced. That's a budget of £170 billion annually now. That's a huge amount of money, and I think nurses, doctors, etc. are within their rights to be saying, hang on, why isn't more of that going to frontline staff rather than self-serving bureaucracy in many cases? But I would take you up on the interest rates, because interest rates have been abnormally low in the last 10, 15 years. And the Daily Express today was saying how Rishi and Hunt are bringing back Thatcher economics.
God forbid. God help us, Emily.
But when Thatcher was around, she brought interest rates went up, and that brought inflation under control. So I think it is a necessity, perhaps, for interest rates to go up in order to get that inflation under control.
I disagree, because where is the current spate of inflation?
We've been running off cheap debt for so long.
Well, the problem is, where is the current inflation coming from? It is not coming from wage claims. I mean, wages in terms of rising, the rises over the last decade or so have been paltry. We are not seeing wage-led inflation in this country. The inflation we're experiencing at the moment has largely come about, as we know, as a result of the war in Ukraine, and also the opening up of the economy after the pandemic and the impacts of global supply chains and that kind of thing. So the idea that in order to overcome that inflation, you go to some of the poorest people in our society, or people on the minimum wage, or people on an average wage, frankly, and say, actually, you have to pay more tax, or your interest rates are going to go up, and therefore your mortgages are going to go up, and, you know, in some cases by £200 or £300 or more a month, or that you're going to have to suffer wage restraint if you work in the public sector, or your public services are going to have to be slashed. I think the idea that that is going to counter the current issue of inflation is not borne out by the facts.
But it sounds a bit of cakeism here, Paul. You know, no public spending cuts, no tax rises on working people. Where are we going to get all this money from? Or are you an advocate of just printing more money?
Well, I think there's an argument to say, actually...
Which is why we're in this mess.
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is. I think there's an argument to say that there is no intrinsic reason why any sovereign currency issuing government should be short of money. Look at what happened during COVID, during the furlough scheme, for example, and bailing out businesses and individuals. And I wasn't opposed to the furlough scheme. I had issues with lockdown. I wasn't opposed to the furlough scheme once lockdown was enacted. But isn't it funny how we were suddenly able to find billions just
But we weren't. Now we're being hit with the bill. That's the problem.
Well, are we being...
That was one of the massive reasons why I was always sceptical of the lockdown, you know, because we were worried. So what's going on where you are, Alice?
Hello there, good morning. Well, you can probably hear from the beautiful music around me that in about 10 minutes a special service will be held here. There's been a service taking place at St Mary's Church behind me, and this is very much a local event when about 3,000 people from the Andover area will be here coming to pay their respects. Andover has very strong links to the military. In fact, the Army headquarters are based here at Marlborough Lines, and the headquarters, the airfield itself, dates all the way back to World War I, and in fact during the Battle of Britain in World War II the airfield was in fact attacked a number of times and a number of people were killed. So from the people, you can see those of you watching are queuing up. We've got cadets, we've got Army personnel, we've got scouts, all sorts of members of the public, veterans who are all going to be coming to pay their respects. At about 11:15 we'll have people coming and laying some wreaths, including the local MP, the local mayor, and then the bugle will sound and we'll have a 2-minute silence which will be taking place. And it's very much a local event that is taking place across the country. Often we focus on the cenotaph in London, but this is something that people all across the United Kingdom come together on this very important day to pay their respects.
Thank you very much, Alice. That was Alice Porter, GB News reporter there from Andover. Now, coming up after the break, we'll be joined in the studio by GB News political reporter Catherine Forster to look back on the week in politics, so please don't go anywhere.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. There's never been a more interesting but also critical time in British politics, and I can't wait to bring you the biggest stories of the day with the best factual accuracy and also a few of my own opinions thrown in. We'll engage in passionate but always polite debate with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Monday to Thursday, 10 till 12 on TV, on radio and online.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
On the Mark Stein Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Stein Show.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England,
Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV,
On radio,
And online.
we're proud to be
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Now, lots of you have been getting in touch this Remembrance Sunday. We have Colin. I will today remember my grandfather who fought in World War II with the Royal Engineers. He was on the beaches of Dunkirk and ensured everyone under his command was safely on a boat, of course. Well, there we go, a lovely moving story. There it goes on. He's written a whole story for us, Colin. Thank you very much. I will read all of that later. Christine says, I remember my dad and uncle who fought in World War II as well, at Dunkirk, D-Day, Tobruk, Italy, and through to Germany. My dad went behind enemy lines, but also don't forget the women at Metal Box in Mansfield making munitions. They listened to workers' playtime when occasionally Lord Haw, the traitor, broke through to tell the women that Germans knew where they were in Rock Valley and that the Metal Box clock was 5 minutes fast, sometimes slow, etc. It terrified them, but they carried on working. We do often forget all the women that served quite the purpose during the war years.
Yeah, and you know, also people on the home front, the women in the factories, the Bevin boys, you know, the people who, the young lads who were old enough to go to fight, but they were needed in the coal mines in order to be able to power the country during those years. So as much as we concentrate on people on the front line, and of course it's right that we do, there was a whole lot of people who were behind the scenes on the home front who were contributing their bit as well. We mustn't ever forget that.
Yes, and also just a couple of views coming in on the migration question, particularly on those protests yesterday in Westminster. There were about 1,500 Albanians reportedly blocking the Westminster Bridge in protest, and of course also in Parliament Square. This was in a protest against Suella Braverman's apparent demonisation of Albanians due to the migration crisis. Alan says, seems extraordinary to me that a group that object to the word invasion should behave in exactly the way invaders would by cutting off Westminster Bridge. I mean, I guess you could make that comparison. I'm not sure.
Can I just read a good one from a little story here?
Very quickly,
from
Paul.
Sally. I'm remembering my dad, Percy Charles. He was one of 8 brothers from Milford, Surrey, who all served in the different services. Though some were injured, they all survived and came home. So lots of personal stories coming.
That is lovely, isn't it? Well, we're going to be moving on to the world of Westminster. Opposition parties have called for an investigation into the behaviour of Cabinet Minister Dominic Raab over claims he mistreated staff during a previous stint as Justice Secretary, including a truly bizarre allegation that he hurled tomatoes from a Pret salad around an office. The horror. The news comes at a poor time for the government, following the high-profile resignation of Minister Gavin Williamson after bullying claims as well. And as you saw, we are joined by GB News political reporter Catherine Forster here in the studio. I must say to everyone at home, you may have noticed there are 3 redheads now in the studio, which I think may be a first for GB News.
And apparently Prince Harry is joining us in a few minutes as well. So
if he can make it all the way over here, he might worry, you know, about the carbon emissions or something like that on his way to get here to the studio. So yes, what on earth is going on? Is Dominic Raab really in a lot of hot water now?
Well, Dominic Raab has been known as quite a tough boss in that he would say he has very high standards, he expects people to work very hard, but that he is clear. But there have been various allegations coming out this week about the throwing of bits of tomato from his salad across into a bin, but also that he had created a culture of fear while he was Justice Secretary, and that when he was reappointed by Rishi Sunak only not even 3 weeks ago, that a group of 15 civil servants had to be taken into a room and basically told, if you don't want to stay working with him, we will move you elsewhere. Now, apparently 6 of them left, 3 of them subsequently came back. But quite serious allegations. Now, it's important to say no formal complaint has been made. But, I mean,
There's no formal complaint?
No formal complaint has been made. The Mirror yesterday was saying his nickname was the Incinerator because he burnt through staff at such a rate. But, of course, it does seem to be a bit of a pattern, doesn't it? Rishi Sunak's only been in the job not even 3 weeks. First, there are all the problems about his appointing Suella Braverman after she had resigned, been sacked over security breaches. Then we moved on to Sir Gavin Williamson, who resigned on Tuesday night after the many, many reports of things that he'd said, including telling somebody to slit their throat. And now, no sooner has Sir Gavin Williamson gone than the narrative has moved on to Dominic Raab. So this is not, obviously, it's bringing into question Rishi Sunak's judgment in appointing these people in the first place. Clearly, Suella Braverman was instrumental in him becoming Prime Minister because her support and that of the right of the party was very important to him getting the job. Sir Gavin Williamson had been a massive supporter of him. Ditto Dominic Raab. Remember, during the summer, during the leadership campaign, he said Liz Truss's economic policies, it would be basically a suicide note to put her in charge of the Conservatives. So clearly, he has debts to pay to these people, but it does feel like there are a lot of people agitating to make trouble for the new Prime Minister.
Yes, because me and Paul were talking about this before we came into the studio. We were thinking that it does all sound a bit sus, that there might be something afoot here with all these secretaries of state, these ministers being accused of such things?
I'd be interested in Catherine's view. I mean, these stories that keep leaking out, we've seen it now about Raab, we saw it about Priti Patel when she was the Home Secretary, we've seen it with Braverman and Williamson and so on. I mean, are these stories, Catherine, coming from senior mandarins, if you like, within the civil service? Because my fear, and I have no time for Dominic Raab, I have no idea what he's like as a human being, but I can't imagine I would ever want to go dancing with him. But my fear is that whenever the civil service now sees a minister who tries to implement a policy or has an ideology that isn't in tune with, if you like, the Liberal establishment, they will immediately try to do what they can to undermine that minister. And we see these stories leaking out. And it seems to be a certain type of minister that we see stories leaking out about. Have we got an activist civil service in the way that we previously expected them to be impartial, but now they no longer are, or is that an unfair charge?
Yes, of course, Priti Patel was also accused many times of bullying as well.
And Boris Johnson protected her. There certainly are suspicions of that. I mean, with Suella Braverman and Gavin Williamson, clearly there were MPs making complaints. It's rather different in the case of Dominic Raab. Conservative MPs, by and large, have been supportive. It was interesting, Philip Davies on Esther McVeigh and his show yesterday was saying that the Home Office and the Justice Department had been one at one time and had been separated out, and at that point that the left-leaning civil servants had gone to the Justice Department. And of course, Dominic Raab is wanting to bring back his Bill of Rights. He wants to make it that European law cannot supersede British law. That's one of the reasons, of course, that the Rwanda plan has been scuppered, because it did ultimately make it through the British cause and then was stopped at a European level. Now, Liz Truss had abandoned that plan because it's going to be obviously extremely difficult to get it through, and especially to get it through the Lords. But that is now back on the table. Now, there will be lots of people that are not in favour of that. But, of course, we don't know. We haven't been in the room. It would seem that throwing a bit of tomato doesn't seem to me to be terribly serious. I mean, Gordon Brown used to throw mobile phones, didn't he?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, Dominic Raab, he does look slightly intimidating when you come across him, and I can imagine that he might be a little bit too outspoken, potentially, when it comes to his...
our senior civil servants to have a bit of backbone and not be snowflakes. Now, look, I'm a trade unionist. I'm completely opposed to bullying in the workplace, but you know, when you're in that high-pressure job as a minister, I think you've got to be able to have those sort of frank exchanges with senior civil servants, which means you probably get angry from time to time. If Dominic Raab is bellowing at, you know, junior office clerks, then of course that's completely unacceptable and would need to be dealt with. But actually, if you're a senior civil servant, you know, you've probably got to that level, I would assume, by having a thick skin, having a bit of backbone. And because a senior minister gets a bit angry with you one day, you really need to take a route out. You really need to take respite that concern.
Also, I do think that it isn't a conspiracy to say that a lot of civil servants, including very senior civil servants, as we were saying, hold completely different views on what good policy might look like, be it in the Home Office or in the justice system or in the Foreign Office and so on. And that must have something to do with the way that these stories get leaked.
Sure. I mean, obviously, they are people. They are supposed to be impartial, but of course they will have political opinions. Everybody does. I think it's very difficult because there are a number of no specific complaint, again, but a number of people that say they've been made to feel uncomfortable.
Coming up, we will return to our conversation about Remembrance Sunday and be observing 2 minutes of silence.
The Big Ben will toll 11 times.
Welcome back to the Political Correction with me, Emily Carver. That was fantastically moving coverage there from the team here at GB News of that Remembrance Sunday service at the Cenotaph in Whitehall. Everyone in the studio here behind me, everyone who works on all the programmes we have here at GB News stood up to pay tribute to our armed forces and the war dead. So that was very moving here in the GB News studio. And I'm sure it was there with you at home too. Now, during World War II, the D-Day operation of June the 6th, 1944, brought together the land, air and sea forces of the Allied armies in what became known as the largest invasion force in human history. The 2-month operation delivered 5 naval assault divisions to the beaches of Normandy and resulted in the Allied liberation of Western Europe from Nazi Germany's control. Our reporter Anna Riley spoke to a D-Day veteran from Leeds about the operation and why it's important to remember the fallen on this Remembrance Sunday.
That the vast convoy should sail unharmed to the coast of France was the Royal Navy's determination. The greatest amphibious operation of all time was got underway.
The D-Day landings marked the start of the Allied liberation of Northern Europe and hailed the beginning of the end of the Second World War. Some 156,000 British, American and Canadian forces landed in Normandy, and Yorkshire veteran Jack Mortimer was one of them, helping secure freedom for the world when he was just 20 years old. Now at 99, Jack recalls how he drove as a dispatch driver carrying ammunition with 12th Ordnance Beach Detachment and landed on Sword Beach as shells and mortar flew overhead.
It was noisy, it was smelly, there were heavy guns, and the big ships in the channel were firing over there was a lot of shells screaming all over the top of us, and but it seemed that I've often thought about it, that everybody seemed to know what they had to do. Everybody of the 130,000, I think, something like that, knew exactly what to do, and all these little bits put together made a great big push, which of course eventually freed France from Nazi Germany.
But the success of the landings weren't without their losses, with more than 9,000 casualties amongst